let me just take a half a second and introduce this special lady. You're very fortunate to have to be here and to be able to hear her. She's one of the few scholars among our LDS community who's been very dedicated and in a very professional way pursued art history and the study of iconography. And she has a lot of positive things to teach us.
I'm sorry. Excuse me for the interruption. Yeah. I'll have to ask you not to speak into this mic because it goes into all the rooms.
Oh, really?
I'm
Okay.
sorry.
Okay. Okay, maybe you can hear me.
I'll just walk up there.
How do you turn it off?
Well, I don't think we can.
Well,
As long as you're not near it.
okay, but I have to have my phone. This, take it away.
But watch for her coming book too. And
Yes, I think my husband is passing out flyers.
so highly recommend.
Okay, thank you, Garth. Can everybody hear me? Because I understand I cannot use the microphone because it will be broadcast in all the other rooms.
Not that the other people don't want to hear it.
Okay, but you can hear me back there? I hope? Okay.
You may have to close the doors.
Okay. The title of my presentation is The King and the Tree of Life, Evidence of Pre-Columbian Contact. And because this is the language of the Book of Mormon Conference, I need to explain why this subject is so important. So I'd like you to keep some of these things, some of these following things that I will mention in mind. Groups of people written about the Book of Mormon, in the Book of Mormon, came from the Middle East. They include the Jaredites, the Nephites, the Lamanites, and the culture or cultures that were involved in bringing Mulek to this land.
Have you been introduced yet?
Yes, I have. Garth
Good.
Norman
Oh,
introduced
good.
me.
Can let's move this a little bit closer, can we?
Oh,
Is that
okay.
possible? So that
Sure.
we,
We're going to try this. I'll turn down the volume for the other rooms. We're going to see if this
Oh, okay.
goes into the other rooms. We're going to see if we can separate the amplifiers from this room from the other
Okay.
rooms. Dave's checking in the other room right now.
no, Diane's unique
See.
and I think of
He'll let us know
member of the church
if this
because
one
she
is
has
good or not.
traveled with the she meeting. You've already introduced her.
Okay, well, just come back and tell me if it's not. So let's go ahead and put it here. And then,
Can you hear in the other rooms for this, or is it okay? This is a test to see whether it's just in this room or the other rooms. We've turned down the amplifiers in the other rooms, supposedly. Tasting, tasting chocolate, vanilla, strawberries.
okay,
good.
okay, great.
That'll be better.
Okay, thanks a lot. Okay. Okay, now you can hear me better?
Tape this so that it doesn't fall off.
The following things that I'd like you to keep in mind, as I mentioned, the groups from the Book of Mormon, and the last culture were what we call the Mulekites, and they would involve any culture or cultures who brought Mulek to this new land. The Lamanites, Nephites, and Mulekites knew the customs and traditions and of those in and about Jerusalem, and most likely Egypt. Of course, we know that the Book of Mormon was written in Reformed Egyptian, and John Tibetanus gives a good argument that Lehi and his sons were metal workers, and who took their wares to various places, and probably including Egypt. The Nephites knew the customs and traditions of their forefathers through Scripture, and this was, of course, from the brass plates of Laban. And lastly, that I want you to keep in mind, the Book of Mormon speaks of Lehi's dream of the Tree of Life, and we are told that it represents the love of God, and especially his Son, Jesus Christ. The objective of this comparative study is to show a clear relationship between the king and the tree of life, or the world tree, in both Mesoamerica and the Middle East. As Latter-day Saints, we know of at least 3 trips from the Near East to Mesoamerica that were a result of pre-Columbian voyages, transoceanic voyages. For those of you who are not familiar with I'm sure you're all familiar with the term Mesoamerica. It generally includes all of Mexico and Central America. Although Middle Eastern cultures date to a time earlier than the period commencing about 1000 BC in Mesoamerica that we will be considering, it is a recognized fact that the traditions were long-lasting in the New World cultures of this geographical area. For example, step pyramids were constructed in Mesoamerica for over 1,500 years. Compare this to the short time span that transpired between the building of log cabins and skyscrapers, and you get the picture. Mesoamerican customs change very slowly compared to our fast-paced world of technology. Mesoamerican peoples had roots going back to the early Olmec culture, and most Book of Mormon scholars, as already been brought out, believe that this relates to the Jaredite culture. Spanning from approximately 2000 to even 200 BC, the Olmec culture existed during the ancient cultures of Egypt and Mesopotamia. After the demise of their far-reaching empire, many Olmec sacred traditions managed to survive through those who followed them. It would be demonstrated that Olmec concepts revolving around the king and his relationship to the world tree, or tree of life, and I do use these terms interchangeably, they made a substantial impression on other Mesoamerican peoples for years to come. Here we have a ruler from Mesoamerica. The king was of prime importance to his people, whether in Mesoamerica or anywhere else in the ancient world where there were kings. One of the things that is unique about Mesoamerican kings, as well as kings of the Middle East, is that they were either considered divine and were messengers of divine revelation from their god or gods, as the case may be. And this is a king from the Middle East, from Israel actually. Referring to the role of a king in Canaan, John Gray wrote, "The king in ancient Canaan is the channel of divine blessings in nature. He is the recipient of revelation. He is also a priest and personally performs sacrifice on behalf of the community." These remarks will be just as much at home in a book on the Maya. The traditions are identical. John Gray also pointed out that in Israel, David was put in charge as the executor of the divine power over forces of chaos in history. This is very significant because this facet of kingship was of equal importance to Mesoamerican kings. First, let us consider the concept of order as opposed to chaos. Psalms 89 in the Old Testament speaks of God as the king who triumphs over chaos. This has reference to the beginning of time, the day of creation when all was set in order. The man-king held the same role. He was the one who was expected to keep a balance and order in his earthly kingdom, seeing to it that it ran as smoothly as the day the heaven's creation, the earth's creation, was accomplished. The New Year festival, which was the religious highlight of the year in ancient Israel, was held at a time when the kingship of God and his anointed king on earth was sustained in light of their ability to conquer the forces of chaos and maintain a continual state of order. This was accomplished through rituals which involved a reenactment of the creation, symbolizing a renewal and order of all things. To show a connection between kings of Mesoamerica and the Middle East, we must first examine the Sumerian and Egyptian symbolism behind the enthroned king. Among the Sumerians, we find a close parallel to the Hebrew culture, which of course was a later development. In Mesopotamia, for example, more often than not, the king was considered the servant of God, and only in a few cases was the king believed to be divine. Here the king is at the left and his God at the right, who is handing him emblems of his rulership. And like Israel, the same type of New Year festival was held each year to reenact the moment of creation, to establish the king who conquers chaos as a representative of God and his revitalization and his revitalized kingdom on earth. Unlike Israel and Sumeria, where the king was considered a sacred chosen vessel who spoke for the divine king, the Pharaoh of Egypt not only spoke for his highest god, but was considered to be a literal son of God. Although the Egyptian king was considered divine, he was also a servant, for he was the one responsible to his divine father and was expected to carry out his commands to ensure order in the cosmos. The Pharaoh, as in other cultures, also performed rituals which reenacted the creation of the world. And he too was expected to conquer death and play out the entire cosmic drama to set all things in order again for his earthly reign, which was considered a metaphor for a new creation. In Mesoamerica, we have a slightly different picture, which in part is like that of Israel and Sumeria, but in fact much closer to Egyptian traditions. In recent years, Mesoamerican scholars have been deciphering hieroglyphic texts that describe royal genealogies and interpreting iconography, and iconography is their art, which is very symbolic, that tell us much about royalty in this part of the world. For example, Joyce Marcus tells us that by maintaining the belief that as a group they had enjoyed a separate divine descent, Maya royalty remained the only individuals who would serve as mediators between the secular commoners on the one hand and the divine supernatural on the other. The Maya in particular went to great lengths to establish their divine ancestral connections. Can Balam, for example, who was the son of the great King Pacal of Palenque in Chiapas, Mexico, falsified his genealogy. Scholars have determined that this was done to reflect his ancestral genealogy back to the founder of the dynasty, and from that point back to the gods of creation. Consequently, both Pacal and Can Balam were considered offspring of divinity. Their eventual godhood was now established without question in the historical records of Palenque. We should note that, according to Jewish tradition, a new king symbolically became, when anointed, as the Son of God. Because the Maya king was descended from divine royalty, he became the special messenger of the gods, which is comparable to the function of kings in the Middle East. It has been well established that kings performed sacrifice on behalf of their people. This is another facet of kingship that has unprecedented close ties in both Mesoamerica and the Near East. In the Near East, the cosmos and men were thought to be periodically regenerated through sacrifice. This could be done through a vicarious sacrifice, where an unblemished animal, human victim, or burnt offerings were used as a substitute for the king. Well, we all know the purpose of sacrifice, and that it was to be in similitude of our Lord's sacrifice for us. But anciently, the people performed this practice without understanding the real reason behind the symbolism of sacrifice and the future atonement. Types and shadows appear throughout these traditions. Please remember, types and shadows. Everything I'm saying is types and shadows. The substitute king is of special interest here, especially in the Middle East, for it was thought that a captive died vicariously for the king in order that both the king and the people might live. For example, in the Egyptian Sed festival, a substitute king was sacrificed, followed by a symbolic resurrection of the king. This rebirth became a realization in the eyes of the Egyptians when the king mounted his throne as the ruler for a new number of years. The same ideology was held in Mesoamerica. Sacrifice could be in the form of burnt offerings, bloodletting by kings, which was a form of self-sacrifice, or the sacrifice of human victims. The more royal, the better. Here is a Maya ruler in front of his royal captive who will soon be sacrificed. Now let me explain where this comes from, because what the Maya king did here was to recreate certain events in the creation mythology recorded in the Popol Vuh. The Popol Vuh, as you already know about, was written by the Quiche Maya of Guatemala in post-conquest times. And what you see on the left is the Quiche with the Spanish script, and on the right is the Spanish in Spanish. But the oral history was passed down from one generation to the next for hundreds of years. In fact, mythology from the Popol Vuh goes back to illustrations on stela from Izapa and around 200 BC, and perhaps even back to Olmec times. The creation story in the Popol Vuh revolves around two brothers, Hunahpu and Xbalanque, who will be referred to here simply as the hero twins. The hero twins, we must note, are ball players. The objective of the hero twins was to defeat the lords of death and chaos in the underworld. This is an event that took place before the day of creation, before all things were set in order. But to accomplish this task, it was necessary for the hero twins to allow themselves to be sacrificed. And because they had divine powers, they were in the end resurrected. Maya kings therefore reenacted the role of the hero twins, and by doing so brought a renewal of prosperity and order into their kingdom. Sacrificial victims were substituted for the king in his role as one of the Popol Vuh hero twins, playing the ball game, opposing supposedly the lords of death. When the hero twin Hunahpu lost his head in the underworld, it was comparable to the loser who would lose his head in the real ball game played by the Maya. The substitute sacrifice theme can also be seen at Piedras Negras, Guatemala, where late classic rulers are portrayed climbing a scaffold as they become enthroned. As you can see, the victim lies at the bottom of the scene. On this particular stela, the king, bloody-footed from the sacrifice of the victim, climbed to the niche. The niche, that cubbyhole that you see at the top, surrounded by symbols of the sky, and it's identified as the heavenly realm. The king sits comfortably upon a pillow inside the niche that had recently held the struggling victim. The victim on this stela was sacrificed vicariously for the king, and now, like a Popol Vuh hero twin who died but defeated the lords of death in the underworld, rises victoriously to his celestial throne as a resurrected deity. Substitute sacrifice had similar implications among the Aztec. At certain festivals of renewal, a handsome youth who was having perfect health and without blemish was lavished upon for a year, given the privileges of royalty, educated, entertained, and even considered a god. As a substitute for the royal sacrifice, he was then killed and thrown down the stairs of the temple, and when the king came out of his temple, it appeared as though he had died and was reborn. This is a rollout from a Mesopotamian cylinder seal. The king also played the role of guardian of nature for the benefit of his people. In other words, if he could ensure there would be rains to bring a good crop, his people survived. If he protected his people from the enemy, his people survived. If he was chosen as the one who was to be in direct communication with the gods, and he had the gods' approval, as a result, his people survived. And so the king was the guardian supreme of his people, just as the first man on the earth was the gardener and guardian of all he surveyed. And on this rollout seal, you can see the king in duplicate next to the sacred tree of life. Geo Widengren, in his book The King and the Tree of Life in the Ancient Near Eastern Religion, reports that in the Near East, the king was actually given the name of gardener, which was considered to be a sacred title. Throughout the art of Mesoamerica are seen images of the king guarding the tree of life, which symbolize not only the king's service to the gods, but that he was the mediator Did I say Mesoamerica? Mesopotamia? Okay. That he had the God's blessings in nature and in the community. In many scenes from the Middle East, the king is shown holding a scepter bearing leaves, branches, or flowers. According to Wirth-2003, this was the twig from the paradise tree, which was the origin of the creation, had been born by Adam himself, who had cut a branch from this tree. This Near Eastern specialist then points out of a tradition that Adam and the kings who came after him carried this life-giving branch of the tree of life in their role as gardener. In Mesoamerica, we find the same thing as gardener king. Among the Aztec, every year, a one-day ceremonial tilling of the land was performed by the king. The tilling was performed in maize fields, and maize is one of the forms of the world tree, or tree of life. He is holding in his hands. And this is a line drawing, you can see it a little better. And we can even go back to the early Olmec civilization and see that it was common for men and gods to hold vegetation from the world tree. And this is Olmec. Perhaps a scenario of the king and gardener would go like this. The first man was the gardener in paradise and was responsible for taking care of it as instructed by his God. He was the first of his race. He is the head of his lineage. He could even be considered the trunk of a genealogical tree of the human race. This was certainly true of Near Eastern kings. In the king's role as the gardener who tends the tree of life, John Gray wrote, "We have surely the original of the primordial man, the Hebrew Adam, the image of God in the Garden of Eden with its tree of life." Among the Maya, the king often wore a costume of the maize god, who was referred to by Minos as first father. To the Maya, first father was the progenitor of the human race. It has already been established that the king was considered the guardian of ordered nature, especially in the context of the world tree. And what is interesting here is that when the Maya king dressed as first father, he demonstrated his association with the first man who had strong agricultural ties. Carolyn Tate wrote that the ruler was the axis that connected the heavens to the underworld. In the Middle East, we have the same concept. According to Iliade, in ancient times, royal cities were considered the image of the cosmos, while the king was the axis mundi. But the most profound thing that I have found in this study is that the king was considered the world tree, the tree of life, the center of the world, and this unique concept was held in both Mesoamerica and the Middle East. The Sumerians in Mesopotamia depicted the tree of life as a god named Tammuz. In fact, he's mentioned in Ezekiel 8:14. Tammuz was considered, he was associated with the underworld and was an ever-dying, ever-resurrecting god. There are many pagan idols who are, again, types and shadows of the deity who would die and be resurrected, but they didn't understand the true meaning of this event. In Sumerian literature, Tammuz was sometimes called a shepherd and or a gardener, and was repeatedly hailed as a cedar, which was his cult tree, as the symbol of this deity. In Mesopotamia, the king was often referred to as a cedar, and in some cases proclaimed himself as the tree of life. Wirth-2003 writes that in the Near East, the king may be viewed as being himself a twig from the tree of life. Now we will return our attention to Egypt. First of all, the great Egyptologist Budge wrote that the god Osiris was also known as the great sky tree. This Egyptian grain god, Osiris, was decapitated and dismembered by his archenemy Set, the god of death, and some of his body parts were placed in a tree from which he was subsequently reborn. In the Maya Popol Vuh, this is kind of low, I guess you can see it. The grain god, who was the father of the hero twins, was decapitated by the lords of death and his head hung in a tree. Okay, little problem. There's probably two stuck together. Well, I'm probably going to keep talking anyway, even if we don't see it. The important thing here is that the symbol of Osiris, the Djed, you all know what the Djed looks like? It's a pillar, and it's a symbol of Osiris, and it's got 4 bars going across it. It has been interpreted as both a tree and the backbone of Osiris. The Djed was originally considered a bound sheaf of the first grain of the harvest. The Egyptian king used the symbol of the Djed to portray stability and his life in the kingdom. Are we getting anywhere? Okay. As for the grain in Mesoamerica, it too was sometimes portrayed as the world tree. And then I'm showing a picture from the Temple of the Foliated Cross in Palenque. It's the maize tree, but in this case it's considered the tree of life. In Mesoamerica, we find the identical meaning for kings with those of the Middle East, that the world tree, the axis of the earth, was materialized in the person of the king. Being a representative of the tree of life or world tree became one of the titles of the Maya kings, where they were often designated as Ahaute. And I have a Mayan hieroglyph showing the Ahaute. The king actually personified the tree in the flesh. Maybe we can just take out or you just can't go forward anymore? What if you shut it off? Is to the Olmec, the earliest civilization that we can turn to look for the root of this tradition. In Mesoamerica, the Olmec were the first to associate the tree with the reigning ruler. There's a pictorial from Dunbarton Oaks, and of course I'm showing this, and I'll tell you what the picture is. There's an Olmec ruler who wears atop his head the personified world tree. In other words, it's got a little face to it, and he's wearing that on his head. And later, the Maya have a similar headdress on a ruler from Kaminahuyu, and as you know, this was the city of Nephi. And it has a bigger branch of the tree of life on its head, a lot big leaves on it. And I did show one where there was the Maya ruler where he's wearing the full regalia of the world tree. I hope we can get that up again. You might ask yourself, now, who does the king unknowingly represent as the tree of life? Who is he imitating or emulating? Who do we know is represented by the tree of life? Of course, these kings did what they did is a result of apostasy from the gospel, but there was still a lingering symbolic knowledge of these things, types and shadows again. We're now going to discuss in reverse and show that the world tree had the same attributes of the king. Some of the earliest representations of the tree of life in Mesoamerica as the axis of the earth were made by the Olmecs. An inscribed stone tablet from Ahuaylacan, Guerrero, illustrates many of these elements. So what there is, there's an X at the top. The X stands as the enclosure of the top of that in Olmec, that represents the sky glyph. And around it are a little arc of 13 squared rounded scallops, which may represent the 13 heavens, because that's what they considered in Mesoamerica, that there were 13 heavens. Under the sky sign, there is a tree touching its branches to the top, to the heavens, and down into the next element. And the next element is a temple pyramid, and that represents the sacred mountain of creation. And under that we have a cave, which represents the underworld, where everyone must return after death and then resurrect. And these interpretations are not just mine, but they are from archaeologists.
Glyphs that are all going down?
Yeah.
Rectangles?
No, it's not Maya glyphs. They're not in cartouches. It's just, it's sort of like a diagram. We'll see if we can get it up later. Then I'll go through it real fast. Throughout the Middle East, festivals were performed that involved the hoisting up of a tree, which symbolized the tree of life at the time of creation. For example, there was a New Year ceremony in Egypt involving the raising of the Jed pillar. Now, this was that pillar with the 4 branches across it. And this is what the king did at the time of his accession or time of reinstatement to the throne. Symbolic of the it's quarter of. Okay, we're not going to have time to finish this, but I want you to tell it what they did. And there's illustrations where the people, they grab hold of their ropes from the top and they are walking around it maypole style. And if you've ever seen the maypole ceremony in Europe, which still goes on today, in fact, southern Bavaria and into Austria has maypoles all over the place. And by going around the maypole, it's as though they participate in the creation of the earth. It's bringing renewal. It's bringing resurrection when all things spring forth in the spring. I'm going to have to skip a little bit. And actually, so I think the maypole started in Egypt. And then in Mesoamerica, they still perform these things. Perhaps you've seen some ceremonies that are have streamers down from a pole, and they set the pole in the ground, and that's the axis of money. That's the axis of the center of the earth. No matter what town you go into, that is their center. What's really interesting, and I wish we had this slide up, but we don't. The Maya king wore the garb of the world tree. He has an apron on of the world tree. It has a face on it because they believe that all things had spirit, and so the tree was alive. But he is the tree of life to his community. And alongside of this apron, there are branches, and that represents the branches of the tree. And you might think about that in terms of something else that I can't mention right now, an apron. In fact, even Charlemagne, who reigned in the 8th century, he had an apron with the tree of life on it. So you have it in both worlds. You have it in Mesoamerica and you have it in the Near East. The same concept. Many of you are familiar with the sarcophagus lid of King Paekao in Palenque. Are you all familiar with that? Okay, so some of you aren't. It's a magnificent sarcophagus lid. And it has King Paekao, who died in his around 80 years old. He is portrayed as the young maize god, who was first father. And he is rising up, he's falling into the jaws of the underworld, and then he rises up with the tree of life springing from his chest. This is his resurrection. Okay, we're up. Okay. Now I'm going to go real fast. This is now you can see everything. Now this is in the Middle East. Okay, now notice the tree. There are always guardians on the side, and there's a bird element at the top. You find the same thing in Mesoamerica. This is Mesoamerica, and this is in Palenque. And here you see there's little birds on both of them. Sometimes they show it at the world tree at the 4 quadrants of the earth. There he is, the king with the world tree. You see, and I darkened this so you can see the branches coming out. And he's got a little face, and that's because and all those plumes on top, they're Quetzal feathers. This is a wonderful sarcophagus lid. And I have another picture so you can see it in a little better. So you can see he's a young person. In fact, this is the position that they show when people are being birthed, reborn, or even when they're just born. And so he's being resurrected. And the tree of life comes springing up. And the bird element at the top. And then I've kind of outlined some of those things. The people of the Book of Mormon had knowledge of traditions in the Middle East for Latter-day Saints. For Latter-day Saints, the picture is clear. And there are many scholars who are trying to pave the way for better understanding of the possibility of sea voyages to the New World in pre-Columbian times. Through prayer, we know the Book of Mormon is true. LDS scholars look to research as a missionary tool to bring others to consider the possibility that these things are true, and hopefully get them to look into these new insights that support the Book of Mormon. Most scholars specialize in just one part of the world and don't afford themselves the opportunity to compare traditions of a culture they understand with other cultures of the world. So what I've done is tried to show both sides, and the similarities are there. I guess we could have a few minutes for questions. I'm sorry we got hung up on there, but I think you got the gist of it. Yes?
What happened to the second hero twins? They first one decapitated.
Actually, the hero twin was decapitated, and his father, the maize god, was decapitated. But they played little games on the lords of death, and they would kill themselves, and because they had magical powers, they could come alive again. So the lords of death said, "Oh, do it to us, show us." And so they killed them, and that was the end of them. And then they resurrected as the sun and the moon. But the point is, they were resurrected. Yes?
There's great criticism of this period of sacrificing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, all that sacrificing wasn't king substitute sacrificing.
Oh no, of course not.
It was just continuous.
Yes, but especially when they captured another king from another polity, that was the royal sacrifice.
Well, how about the younger ones when they would come in and they just had many sacrifices?
Well, that was, the Maya did sacrifice, but I'll tell you, it was the Aztecs who are a little later culture, and they were the ones who did massive sacrifices.
But didn't the Mayans also? You said they,
Yes, they did.
what was the purpose of that? All saying they
Yes, they did blood sacrifice because they knew blood sacrifice was necessary for the continuance. And that's why they did it. It was,
With agriculture and that kind of thing, rebirth of.
yeah, rebirth of everything. Mm-hmm. Anything else? Okay, that's it.